Giga korale. Iku blojko, rusula rusiu. Holaka holala, halagu gu...
Howdy, and welcome back to another season of Film and Season 6 for the spring semester of 2022. I'm Dan, and well, it's lovely to be back for my final season of Film and here at Champlain College. I'm back here in the Champlain Wave offices. The Eats dining room is quite full and a bit loud if you hear that in the background. And it is, well, an unseasonably temperate and cloudy day here in Burlington, Vermont. It kind of feels like the Pacific Northwest, except there's 1.5 feet of snow on the ground. So take that as you will. Wow, here it is, last season, starting it off today. I spent the past month brainstorming what I should kick off season 6 with, and it was a challenge. It was hard. I had a lot of ideas. There was like 2 or 3 big ideas I didn't get to last semester. There was a bunch I wanted to get to this semester already. So I was like, what do I start with? What do I have time to even get to? And I mean, this month has a lot of things going on as well, just current events. Namely, you got the Oscar nominations being announced on Tuesday for all the 2021 films. Quick summary of my thoughts of the Oscars. I do want to put this in here because I don't think we're going to have an Oscars episode this year. Unless Connor really gets me to do one. I don't think I'll be doing one this year. I didn't mind most of the picks. Everything I wanted to get highlighted mostly did. There were even a couple surprises, like Troy Kotsur nominated, being the first deaf man for the movie Coda, which is something I did not see coming. That was really cool. Because that was just a performance I genuinely liked personally, and I never thought it would get anything beyond just my personal enjoyment of it. But the Oscars going on to nominate it, and it is a great performance. It was really cool. I loved that. And yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, the slightly more obscure stuff that me and Connor may nominate for the Andes were not listed, so it does kind of feel like business as usual. But yeah, no, I feel this year, more than most, feels like a return to the somewhat normalcy of the 2019 Oscars. Which was hosted only weeks before the pandemic started. So, it's a good sign. And we also have so many good movies coming out soon. I am kind of excited at the very slow, but definitely upward progression of the film industry moving forward. And that's not as a filmmaker, that's a film watcher and a film obsessor. So yeah, we got a lot of good stuff coming out. And another great sign that, happened over the winter break while we were all gone, stuck under 2 feet of snow here in Vermont, was Spider-Man No Way Home. Box office smash hit, which I did not mind at all. Really fun. I just saw it for a second time a couple days ago. And yeah, it holds up, and I'm really happy. Granted, I know it's an MCU movie, so obviously I think it's going to be huge, big budget and very big box office return. But like just the absolute magnitude of people who went to go see this right when it came out and continued to. I mean, the box office shows people want to go to some movies, and I'm excited for that. We have Batman coming up in a month. That'll be exciting, and plenty more. So we'll see if we talk about any of those on this final season. But yeah, back on track. I've been thinking a lot about the season opener, and I looked to the season openers of past for inspiration. Like, how did we start off all the rest of them? There's obviously Connor's iconic season 1 premiere discussing the 1960s and Sharon Tate. The season 2 Andes and Oscars episodes. Season 3 was an interesting one because we started off with 3 movies you may have missed in 2020 and 3 to look out for. And one of mine, Death on the Nile, a movie to look out for, that was supposed to come out a year and a half ago, is coming out tomorrow, I believe. This Friday. So finally we're getting that. That's cool. And then obviously season 4, the Anya Taylor-Joy tier list, and last season with the obscure genre starter pack. So I really wanted to encapsulate a couple of those all into one episode, and specifically with one film. You know, I mean, this, above all, for this episode, it feels like a spiritual sequel to the obscure genre starter pack that I did last season. But this time around, I picked one film to highlight and only one obscure genre. And this week, we are talking about 1966's Who Wants to Kill Jessie? Now, Who Wants to Kill Jessie is a Czech film and is considered a unique addition to the movement known as the Czech New Wave. And now a lot of film people who might know European cinema in the mid-century probably point to the most famous film movements, like you have an Italian neorealism, your Roberto Rossellini's Rome Open City, or Stromboli, you have Fellini's 8.5, or La Dolce Vita, or De Sica's Bicycle Thieves, huge one. And if it's not the Italians, a lot of people turn to the French New Wave of Agnes Varda, Jean-Luc Godard, and Jacques Demy. A lot of great films coming out of there. But the Czech New Wave, a different New Wave movement, hit its peak a bit later, in the second half of the 1960s. It was a thriving film movement and community just like the rest, but it had one really strong difference. The freedom of filmmaking that accompanied Agnes Varda or Fellini or Godard was not given to the Czech filmmakers of the day, and the entire movement was heavily influenced by the fact that Czechoslovakia at the time was underneath the Iron Curtain and was subject to Soviet censors for the entirety of its existence. And it would end up being its undoing in a sense. The biggest director of the Czech New Wave actually made a successful transition to Hollywood cinema, which is Milos Forman, director of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Amadeus, Man on the Moon. So, I mean, has a film that wins Best Picture twice. Very successful. But before moving to America, he actually filmed one of the most iconic Czech New Wave films in 1967, The Fireman's Ball, which helped a little to put Czechoslovakia on the map for cinema. Now, the movement lasted roughly from 1963 to 1970, but the final 2 years there, 69 and 70, were very inactive from the rest because the movement pretty much ended in 1968. Because in August of that year, the Soviet Union led Warsaw Pact troops in an invasion of Czechoslovakia to crack down on the reformist trends in Prague that were happening in the past 2 years. In 1968, known as the Prague Spring, it was a point in the country's history where officials and citizens were working to expand the rights of citizens and introduce elements of democratization, which the Soviet Union tried to crack down on. And I hate to say it, they succeeded. You know, the final 2 years of films being released before August of 1968, and really 1968 in general, were either shelved or censored beyond recognition upon its delayed release. So during the Czech Spring, some films of that time reflect this struggle way more overtly than others. I mean, there's some pretty obvious themes that are irradiating through these films, especially leading up to the whole Soviet Union with a human face movement that the Czech Republic was trying to put their spin on in 1967, 1968. But Who Wants to Kill Jessie stands as a very fascinating crossroads of so many genres and ideas. And now I don't want to call the Czech New Wave an obscure genre, because I think that actually has a pretty, maybe not mainstream appeal, but it has a very obvious, like, landmark footstep in European cinema in the mid-century, you know? But when I'm talking about obscure genres, I will call Czech sci-fi absurdist comedies an obscure genre, because that is exactly what Who Wants to Kill Jessie is. Now, this movie was very hard to find, but I had to buy it online, and I had it shipped, and when I got it, it came with this great little booklet that talks a lot about the movie and its creation, as well as its reception. A lot of the writing of this booklet being done from Susan Dahl, who actually writes many cine notes for Facets Video, which is the company that distributed this copy of Who Wants to Kill Jessie, along with very many other Czech films. So, a summary. Produced in 1966, Who Wants to Kill Jessie tells the story of a scientist couple who don't exactly have the ideal marriage. The wife, a state scientist, develops a formula for ridding dreams of their unpleasant images and emotions. But when she discovers that her husband is fantasizing about a comic strip vixen named Jessie, she administers the formula to rid him of his dreams. Unfortunately, the doctor does not yet realize that her serum has a serious side effect. What it dispels from dreams actually enters reality, and out of the blue, Jessie and her two antagonists kind of come stumbling out of the newspaper comic strip and into the real world. And that really is kind of the catalyst of the film. You have this married couple, pretty unhappy, awkward, this kind of somewhat bumbling but pretty smart husband, and the very unfeeling and intellectually superior wife. Both scientists, engineers in their own way, and she develops this dream serum, basically the idea to change dreams and get rid of bad apparitions in dreams, which kind of leads this to be the sci-fi half of this sci-fi absurdist comedy film. A lot of recent examples. Look at Inception. Look at the 2000s anime Paprika. Dreams, dream machines is a very interesting, and I would argue kind of unutilized kind of topic in cinema. And I guess that really leads me and my modern sensibilities to feel that Who Wants to Kill Jessie still feels fresh. It still feels like it's breaking onto ground that hasn't been too broken into yet. You know, this is kind of a fresh take on what it means to dream and to understand and manifest dreams in reality. And obviously, this is representational of some other underlying themes that we'll get to later on, but I just wanted to kind of mention this now, that this is kind of interesting for the time and definitely forward-thinking in that sense, despite it being a comedic film. So basically, this is inspired by a comic book, and you see the comic book in the film, and a lot of the inspiration for the film comes from the idea of comics. You know, this is an inspiration of the visual style, and it really brings this fun, absurdist take on the idea of comic book characters just coming to life. And it leads into an idea that this film really fits into a cool trilogy of films. And this is something that not only Susan Dahl, but plenty of other people have kind of made this connection with Who Wants to Kill Jessie of the time. But this really works in a kind of a triple feature of Czechoslovakia's Jessie, Italy's Modesty, and America's Barbarella, which is probably the film. If you're going to know any of these three, it's Barbarella. So basically, you know, talking about this within the context, Who Wants to Kill Jessie and is in 1966, along with Modesty Blaise, 66, and then 1968's Barbarella. And Barbarella, originally created by Jean-Claude Forest for serialization in France's V magazine in 1962, ends up being a concept that was turned into a standalone comic book and then a movie, obviously starring Jane Fonda in one of her most iconic roles of the late 1960s. And then you have Modesty Blaise, a comic strip character created by Peter O'Donnell and originally drawn by cartoonist Jim Holdaway. The strip follows the adventures of an exceptionally talented young woman who fights crime while hiding her shady past. And again, you kind of have these sort of sci-fi elements coming into this one, but way more toned down than Who Wants to Kill Jessie. But essentially, you have Who Wants to Kill Jessie being actually the first of this trilogy. And it's an interesting little thing that pops up in the 1960s, is this idea of these comic book fantasies of the era that have like kind of a quirky tone, but in this way, and with all three of them, is uniquely from their country. You know, I'll say that Who Wants to Kill Jessie is a very Czech film. It's a very Eastern European film in the sense, and it really does kind of boil down to a lot of the visual style and how the film was produced. And it's so cool to kind of discuss this. So, I'm gonna take a quick PSA break while we have the chance to, because I could. This is kind of one long running topic, but I'll break it here. But when we come back, we will be talking about kind of the visual style and the creation and just the overall impact of Who Wants to Kill Jessie.
Running late to class but still need that morning caffeine or hot breakfast to start your day out right? Download the Bite app by Sodexo and place your custom order for fast, easy pickup at Zyme. Open 8:30 a.m. to 3 o'clock p.m. Mondays through Fridays.
I'm jumping in with my clothes on.
Most party fouls are pretty dumb, but if you decide to drink and drive underage, you could lose your license and your freedom. Learn more at ultimatepartyfoul.org. Brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Ad Council.
All right, welcome back to Film and Season 6 premiere. We're talking about the 1966 Czech new wave sci-fi absurdist comedy, Who Wants to Kill Jessie? And essentially where we left off, talking about the visual style and the kind of the production as well. And a lot of the techniques that were used with this film, all ones that kind of reverberate through a lot of Czech films at the time. You have these fresh-looking fictional narratives, essentially, because they're using kind of documentary techniques, non-professional actors, improvised dialogue, gritty camera work. It's very much a grounded visual style, but it's done so on the fly. It's done so accessibly that the real world gets captured in a very real sense, and it doesn't lose any of the artistry within that. It doesn't feel like a documentary in any sense of the word, but it feels like you're in rooms, you're in houses, you're not on a soundstage, you know? This is being shot in real life, and I think that really adds to kind of the dichotomy of this film, because you have a very grounded visual style, in a sense, but that's paired with all the fun special effects they do for the comic book style. And it's very interesting because, you know, you have these pretty overt, obvious comedic tropes that are being put into it. You have like a bumbling policeman who is asked to stay at the sewer grate when Jessie jumps in, and he's there for like the entire night, and then he sees Jessie running across the street, realizing that she was never going to come back out. When he goes to like try and stop her, he falls in the manhole and he just dumps into the sewer, and it's a very funny moment. You have tropes like that. You have like these classic almost, I don't know, silent film tropes. But, you know, you're Charlie Chaplin. You're very kind of, again, absurdist, madcap, slapstick in a sense. But this is paired with a very weird, like, topic in general. Because I feel like this same story, the same log line of this story that I kind of said in the beginning, where a doctor creates a serum where it can get rid of your bad dreams, but those come into the real world when they're removed out of your head. That could be a very different movie. That could be a very serious, that could be a horror movie. That could be like a bleak sci-fi movie. That could be an action movie. It could be so many things, but what's so interesting is that it takes this idea and turns it into a comedy. It turns it into like pretty overt escapism and just feel-good filmmaking, you know? And that's, I gotta say, one of the most admirable traits of this film, because as it kind of fits into this comic book fantasy trilogy with Modesty Blaise and Barbarella, there's another trilogy that I think it can go into very well, and it's the sci-fi. And this is actually another trilogy of purely Czech films that kind of is highlighted in the later 60s. Two other lesser-known Czech New Wave films, specifically The End of August at the Hotel Ozone and Valerie and Her Week of Wonders. And it's two really interesting films, which are really the only two kind of major examples of films that employ some sci-fi elements to the Czech New Wave. You have Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, which is like this gothic humor, and it's this unusual vampire tale set in 19th century Europe, following the adventures of a girl who's coming of age amidst a strange series of events in her small village, almost Dracula-esque in a sense. And then you also have The End of August at the Hotel Ozone, which you have Valerie in the past, Jessie set in the present, and then you have Hotel Ozone as a futuristic narrative. So essentially, nuclear war has destroyed most of civilization, reducing the few remaining humans to a primitive existence. An older woman who vaguely remembers the time before the bombs fell leads a pack of wild girls to search for men who can give them children and kind of restart humanity. At a crumbling hotel, they come upon an old man who refuses to let go of the old ways from a lifetime ago. Bleak and haunting, Ozone was written by Czech New Wave film director Pavel Juracek, who offers a chilling look at the future of humanity. And this was actually an official selection for 1967's Cannes Film Festival. And it's interesting to kind of look into these sci-fi films and the idea that of these few, there is still this mix of science fiction in Czech New Wave. I mean, you look sort of at Italy in France, and you have these films that are very much more based in reality, very much human stories, right? For example, one of the only films I can think of is Agnes Varda's Les Creatures, The Creatures, from 1966, which also employs this sci-fi narrative of like this guy in a lighthouse with this weird device he can control everyone in his small town. And that's a really interesting film, because I think Varda's one of the only people during arguably the height of the French New Wave to employ kind of sci-fi themes that I've seen, at least. And I'm talking like overt sci-fi themes. But what other film can be said for this era that fuses this sci-fi element with slapstick comedy, you know, with this absurdist fun use of like visual gags? Like they're in a courtroom at one point with Jessie and they're trying to figure out, oh, are these comic book characters people? You know, the unfeeling wife is like, no, they're not people. Just get rid of them, whatever. And one of them speaks. And all of the comic book characters speak in speech bubbles in the film. The speech bubbles like show up. But the way they show that is that they physically show up in the world. So characters have to look at like this little cardboard square or something. And then the judge is like, could someone please move their text bubble so the court recordist can see what they said? And one of the guards next to Jessie moves her speech bubble so the court recordist can write it down and be like, oh, that's what she said. All right. And that's so, it's so funny. It's like, it made me laugh out loud. Like, it was a great moment. And it's just these really absurdist things, but you consider, like, how did the filmmakers decide to adapt this idea, you know? It's this film adaptation from a comic book it's taken so literally. Like, imagine if this was real life, and it's like, okay, a person shows up, and if they're speaking in speech bubbles, those speech bubbles now exist in real life as well. It's like taking the format and the artistry of comic books and kind of recontextualizing it in a very interesting way. In a very funny way, because it's funny. It'd be a humorous situation if this was happening in real life, I think. I mean, and this it just allows it so much. It informs so much of the comedic style of the film. And furthermore, this film really does just explore so many of the ramifications of comic book physics and attributes translated into our reality. And it is kind of like, I think one of the harder things to tackle with this film is you kind of have to accept you're in its universe, playing by its rules. And so many other new wave films, neo-realist films, play by our society's rules, all reality's rules. And this film, Who Wants to Kill Jessie, really flips that on its head, and that is just deeply fascinating to me, you know? So, I mean, it's hard not to just go on and on. I could go about every scene, I could talk about the performances or the visual style more, all the gags, the ending, but I really do want to talk about, like, the context and where this film ends up in the history of cinema. Like, how does it stand? And, you know, I mean, as I researched this film and I watched it, I mean, and enjoyed it so much, I had to ask, why is this film not being lifted up as much? Because I discovered it's not. It's not a well-known movie. That should be pretty apparent by the fact that it took me forever to find a DVD copy to get it. Even in the booklet for this movie, in some of the opening paragraphs, it does kind of state its own obscurity. Little known in its day and rarely mentioned in film history books, Who Wants to Kill Jessie is surprisingly hip, particularly within the context of the 1960s. And that's very true, but I think you can attribute it very much to the fact that Czechoslovakia would go on to be occupied by the Soviet Union for another 20 years. And this film wouldn't see really the light of day internationally in any, really ever again. Still hasn't seen it. The only really big accolade it kind of has is it was a special mention at the Locarno International Film Festival. Beyond that, there's not too much else where this film is getting recognized, either during its release or in years after. And I really feel like the booklet itself, Susan Dahl and everyone over at Facets Video, kind of summarize this really interesting film because, you know, this is coming from a place of appreciation. And the director, Václav Volacek, is kind of the subject of this. Because Václav Volacek carved out a successful career as a director of fairy tales, fantasies, and children's films, which is pretty much most of his other notable works, it is likely that he suffered less scrutiny and fewer indignities than the high-profile, air quotes, Czech New Wave filmmakers. But that might also be a reason why Volacek has not received his due from film scholars and historians. Hopefully, with its recent run in film programs and now its release on DVD, Who Wants to Kill Jessie may be destined to win over new audiences with its witty set pieces and quirky sensibility. And I truly hope that's the case. I would love for this episode to be just a beacon of someone go watch this movie. It's good, you know? Because this movie, with its comic book inspiration, its visual style, it just brings a really fun and absurdist take on the idea of comic book characters coming to life. But overall, I mean, this film is fun, really fun, and it stands the test of time, as well as being equal parts escapist and subversive when looking at Czech society in the 1960s. And it's really hard, you know, when you're going into the deep, deep annals of film history, because there's thousands, tens of thousands of films out there. It's really rare to find a film that takes so many different unique angles of comedy and sci-fi and new wave filmmaking and turn it into something that's palatable, that makes sense, that has a good story and also feels just socially relevant. You know, because 2 years after the release of this film, we don't get Czech New Wave films anymore. The movement ends. The Soviet Union invades. Milos Forman leaves the country, one of the leading directors of the time, and he goes to America. And we get kind of his take of Hollywood cinema. And then we don't hear from really anyone afterwards, unless it's heavily censored films or just shelved films, you know? And it's examples like this that kind of speak to this unrest of not just America in the 1960s. We're talking Europe as well. We're talking a lot of the world has unrest in the 1960s. And Czechoslovakia is no exception. And it's interesting to look back and see these films that have kind of informed times of struggle. And you talk about the Czech Spring. This occurs right before 1967, 1968, when people in Czechoslovakia are trying to improve their country, add elements of democracy, give some more freedoms and rights to their people. And you have a film like this that comes out. And this is during this era where there's this creative expression that's starting to open up again. We're seeing it. It's very similar, I think, to the cinema of Iran in the 1990s. You have people like Kiarostami who are creating these very creative, subversive, and very obviously socially charged films. And then eventually, you know, Iran shuts down. And then right in the 60s, Czechoslovakia shuts down as well. You lose these moments, but you always have those films. You always have those couple of years when people came in and took the advantages they had to make films that matter, make films that talk about where they are in life and kind of bookmark their society's chapter in human history. And that's why I think Who Wants to Kill Jessie might be one of the best Czech New Wave films ever. If you look up Czech New Wave films, you won't see it on the Wikipedia page. You won't see it on anybody's real lists. It's hard to find. But if you can search this out, if you can find clips with hopefully English subtitles, that's what I needed, check it out, you know, and appreciate this film for what it is. Because, you know, on the surface level, I think it really can be just interpreted as just a fun, goofy, weird European 60s movie for, again, people like of my modern sensibility, an American in the 2020s. But, you know, with just a little context, with a little history, with a little backstory, it becomes so much more. And it's not just that. You have these deep themes of dreams and how the main plot device involves the manipulation of dreams to eliminate negative images and emotions that could be interpreted as a political parable about brainwashing through propaganda and the curtailing of freedom of thought. You have that wrapped up, hidden within this, again, absurd comedy. It's some of my favorite cinemas is the subversive cinema, the stuff that needs to be hidden. The hidden messages. It's like apologies for me to go full film nerd because I'll be talking about my favorite director. And I try to avoid my favorite directors because if I come on here and talk about my favorite directors, I just gush and it just goes on forever. But Andrei Tarkovsky, Soviet director in the 60s, 70s, 80s, in his stint in the Soviet Union was making very subversive films. And there's something so deeply impactful about watching a film and not seeing what it means, but knowing what it means. Being able to understand the context of the film. You know, it explains so much more about it. And it feels like you're watching two stories unfold at once. You know, not just the film, but the filmmakers as well. And that's just so special. So that's why I wanted to kind of bring up Who Wants to Kill Jessie, because those, for me, are just really meaningful films. So it brings our episode to an end. We're finished up on this season 6 premiere, talking about Who Wants to Kill Jessie. As always, all the films we talk about on this show are going to be on my Letterboxd film and list at DA_N. That's a DA_N on Letterboxd. And of course, if you're listening to YouTube, I'll have Connor's original film and list linked below as well, from Cranberry 18, CRANDberry 18. Yeah, I mean, we'll see how this season goes. I have some exciting stuff planned, hopefully. Hoping to get some other voices in this empty room as well. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. Have a lovely night, and you will be hearing from me next week.